So, we are back on the second part of this course, and I like to start creating the other layers we need to work to create the final version. So, we have this particle system, but I like to set to off both because we have to go to create a new one. So, the new one will be the simplest one, and we'll see later if needed for the final rendering of or if we have to tune it a little bit. So right mouse button, new, particle system, standard flow. Let's move it, and then right mouse button, rename, and we call it PF layer 003. Okay, back to the particles. I like to have all the particles at the beginning, but I like to have it a little bit before, so we can make some movements before we start. The particles are linked to the text, so we go to have, let's go for the first one. Okay, we can use directly the position object, and we use the text we have, so by list, and we use text. Okay, so we need to say to use the volume. So let's go maybe to create from the text a copy, clone, and let's call it volume, so we can use this one instead of the other one. And there we say remove by list and volume. So in this case we can have a material for the volume, and the material for the text we'll use in the rendering. So there we need to create a new material, and we can assign the same material we used before, this one with a little scale. Okay, and now in the particle system we say to put all the particles inside the volume. So let's say that the text volume object properties is display as box. Okay, and we say to use the volume, and we have no speed, so we can remove it with the delete, and we have no rotation, delete, and sorry, I made a mistake, so position object, because so I have to put again the position object, I have to remove the speed, so delete, and this one is with a volume, and we have volume, and we have grayscale, so it will use the grayscale to create the particles there. So we have something like a gaseous inside the text, but to have the gaseous effect, let's say that we see 100% of particles, and we go to have, let's try with maybe 20,000. So a lot of particles, and you see it takes a little bit. This is lower when we are using the particles, just in the case we are using a texture. So it is using the procedure to understand how much particles and where he needs to put the particles. So obviously it is slower than in the other case. So as soon as we'll see the particles, it will be just to be sure it is working, and then we'll put something inside to make a little bit of noise, a little bit of turbulence, to create a turbulent structure of gas inside the logo. And this one will be stable, so we'll have just a little bit of movement done by noise. So now we can set to dots, so you see that it is a strange gases because we have some turbulence. Let's use maybe a different color just to make it more visible. Okay, that's nice. But if we like to have some kind of movement, we have to add something. So we can say to use for the moment just 5% of particles inside the viewport. So it is regenerating the particles. Okay, we have just a little bit. And we can go back to ticks to make it more visible. And now we can add a random walk. Again, if you have the random walk, you can use a wind with a turbulence. Let's put the random walk there. Now we set it to have just a little bit of movement, nothing so special. So you see that in this case, now we have this one, and you see that it's moving really fast, but I like to have a slower movement. So the speed now is set to 100. Let's try to have 10. It needs to recalculate the first 20 frames because we are starting the particles at -20. Then the node size is too big. I like to go lower. Let's do maybe 4. Let's wait for the update. Okay, and we can have a variation in percentage about the speed. Let's go for 35% to have a little bit of variation. And now we go to change a little bit the viscosity, but before I like to see how it is moving. You see that it's moving still a lot. So let's go back and let's go for a lower speed. Let's try with 1. So really slow movement. Let's wait for the update. If we go to see, you see that the particles now are moving really slow. Okay, let's go to have an higher viscosity. Let's go for maybe 350, and we go to have a variation. The variation can be 50%, so we have a variation for every particles, and we'll have all different values for the viscosity, particles by particle. Let's go to see. You see that the particles are still moving slow, maybe a little bit faster than before, but now we have a higher viscosity. So when we'll have more particles inside the viewport, we'll be able to see that it's moving more like a fluid. We can go maybe just a little bit higher to 450. And then this one is done. So we have the right position. I like to see maybe with a little bit more particles. So let's go with dots. And there we can say that we like to see maybe 25% of particles. So it is done. We can see how it is moving, because you see the slow part is just when it needs to create it. So it is moving in a really fluid way. We have some kind of preview there with not so much particles. We can do more, but it needs time. So for the moment it's nice. Let's go to 5% of viewport. So we'll have less particle generation. And we can set to off and save. And we can generate the last particle layer. So let's move there and let's go for a new. So right mouse button, new particle system, standard flow. Let's move it there. And this one will be the, with the right mouse button, rename. It is the PF layer 004. This one obviously is set to on. And we are going to create something a little bit more complex. So I like to have the particles there for the moment starting at 0. Let's try with 200 particles. Then we'll have the emitter will be the a volume around the text, and to do something like that I like to create a bigger sphere out there. So let's make a clone and we call it this one outer sphere bigger. Okay, you see that now it is visible, and I like mainly to scale it on this side and this side. And then right mouse button, object properties, display as boxes for this one too. So back in the particle view, save. Let's go at full screen. So we'll have a position object to emit the particles by list, and we'll use the bigger. So we see to use the surface, and we like to have just a little bit of offset, so it will start in a outer area and the inner area on the surface. Let's say they're 30, so we'll have some variation. Let's say to see actually 100% particles, and then I don't want to have speed, so delete, and rotation, delete. Nice. So the first thing I like to do is to find the target. So I like to find something, and what I like to do is to find the text. So let's go to have the find target, and we can put it there. Let's move this one on the side. So we go to have a mesh object by list, and we go for, we can use also the text volume. So if we go to check the animation, you see that the particles are moving really fast. They go over the mesh. Let's go with a brighter color to see it. Okay. So there we can use a lower speed. Let's try with something like 20. And in this way you see that the particles are moving slower, but I like to have a variation, so let's try to have 10. So we have speed between 10 and 30, and obviously we have different speed, and then I like to have less acceleration. So the particles are starting really slow to move and then use the speed we know. You see that now we have a really big chaos. Then I like to use the closest surface about the point to attach the particles to the closest point. Okay, and then we know that when the find target is found, I like to have the lock again. So we can use the same lock we use it there. So let's copy and paste assistance and connect. So we can use there the text one, it's not a problem. So you see the particles is arriving and then is locking over the particles. Done. So this one is really simple, as you see, nothing so complex. It's really similar to the previous one actually. But now I like to add something. I'd like to add the spawn event. So we'll create some trails for those particles. So let's pick a spawn and we connect the spawn there. And if we go to see now the animation, you see that actually, let's use a display just to check the spawn. Okay. If we go to simulate, you see that we have just the burning of a copy of the particles we are creating there. But I like to create something like a trail, so we have to set to by travel distance, and we have to use a lower step size because now you see this moving, and that's what it is creating. So for the moment we can go for 0.5, and we say that maybe actually all the particles have spawning. Later we can change it. And we'll have less speed iteration, so let's say 70, and you see that the particles are moving slower than the further particles. And then we say that we like to have variation. Let's go for 40%, 45% variation of the speed, so we have more chaos on the particles animation. But actually we are going to have maybe later a little bit of divergence. If we set 0 to the divergence, you see that we have just trails, and later we'll tune it. So now what I like to do is to have a random walk for this one to create something like a fluid effect. If you don't have the random walk, again, you can use the wind. Let's put the random walk there, and we can start to set the random walk. If we go to set, you see that now we have all those kind of strange effects. I like to have less speed. Let's go for 5 with maybe 45% variation. So you see the particles are moving slower, and we are just generating a chaos. We can start to say that just some particles have the spawning. So let's go for 25%. So 25% of particles has the spawning and other particles has no spawning. Okay, back to the random walk. There I like to have a lower size for the noise. Let's go for 8 maybe. So you see it's more chaotic. And I like to have a really high viscosity. So let's try to have 800 with a variation of 60%. So you see that we have a really chaotic stuff. Okay. All these particles can have a little bit of dragging, so I like to say that they are moving slow. So first of all, let's go to have more particles, let's say maybe 900. But we say that just a lower percentage will have the spawning, let's say maybe 3%. So actually we have something like that. Okay. And let's go to have their dots and dots also there. So we have just some points, and then you see that we are creating some filaments inside the scene. Nice. Okay, I like to have a little bit of drag. So we have to go inside the space warps, drag. We can create a drag there. So drag, and we set at -50 because maybe more, because later we can move the particle burning. And there we set to 350 to be sure that the drag force is working every time. So we can add the force, and there we say to use the drag. And now I like to have 5 times the force, the energy we have now. So you see that now we are creating something like that, really a fluid movement of the particles. Okay. We have now the possibility to say that the particles after a while will die. So let's use the delay there if we have some particles that are still visible, and we say that maybe by particle age at 100 frames with maybe 35% of variation. If we have some particles that are not more staying away, will die. Okay, same thing done there, because I like to have maybe just the, or maybe not, we can kill it if we don't need it inside the rendering. So now I like to say that the particles will move after a while. So let's go for an age test. And there we say that when the age is higher than, let's say maybe 200, with a variation of maybe 50% of 50 frames, sorry, we go to another event and we'll try to find again our text. So let's go with the find target, connect. Let's see what happened. we have the particles there, they are creating some filaments, and then they are changing, you see, and going to connect to the text. And the fine target, obviously, we have to set. This time we can use maybe a nice speed with a 300, maybe with a variation, but the acceleration will be lower. We are going to link to the text, and again we use the closest point. So if we check, you see the particles, they are creating some filaments, then they are dying, but maybe we can remove this one. Okay, they are moving and moving and create filaments, and then they are moving to create the particles. Okay, later we'll tune it a little bit, and then we need to create something more, because I like to create an additional effects. And obviously again we have the lock and bond to our mesh as always, so we can go to copy our lock and bond, copy, and we can have it at distance. When we find the target, we lock. So again, let's check, and then the particles are arriving and they are locking over the mesh. And let's go as dots and dots. Okay, nice. Now we have to create another kind of effects. I like to generate the spawning when the particles are moving there. So let's go for a spawn. Let's move this one on this side. Sorry. And the spawn will be by travel again, and I like to have a speed control over the particles to move it as I like. So connect the spawning, and in the spawning we say to use the by travel, but we use obviously less particles. So let's say that just maybe the 3% of the particles can be spawnable. Let's use 70% of the speed, but we don't restart the particle age, so we have the same age for the trails and the new trails we are creating. Just a little bit of variation for the speed and just a little bit of divergence. Let's go to check back the divergence there. In the first spawning we created this one, and maybe there we can use a higher divergence to create a strange effects. So 180 can be nice. And now in the speed we are using, we can have a random 3D, so the particles are moving all around with a really low speed and a little bit of variation. Let's see what happened. We have particles there creating the trails and then moving all around. You see, creating some new filaments. Let's go for dots, so it will be more visible. So you see we have sub-filaments over the filaments. Nice. I like to add a random work also there, because I like to create a randomic movement. The random work there again as a little bit of speed. Let's go for 2, just a little bit, with a high variation. 45 can be enough, and a low scale, so we can try with 5. And again, I like to have a really high viscosity. Let's go for 500 with a 45% of variation. Let's go to see what is happening. So you see we have this kind of filaments moving, and then the particles still trying to create our text. I like to have a little bit of dragging, so we can use the same force as before, but maybe we can use a little bit less. So let's go to pick the force. Okay, it is updating the particles. Let's go to the first frame. In the force, by list, drag, and we'll use maybe just 3 times and half the power we had before. Now we can use an edge test, and we can use the same we are using there. So copy and say path assistance, and then let's move a little bit this one. Let's make a little bit of space, and now we go to connect this one to the other event we just created. You know, sometimes that's a little bit of problem. So when the particle edge is right, we use the find target to go and find our logo. Let's go to check. So we have the filaments, the other filaments, and then all the particles goes to create our logo. Perfect. So there we have the find target. We can use just a little bit of random walk to have more chaos there, so we can have the right chaos during the animation. So again, let's go to pick a random walk, and a random walk there will be maybe something like let's say just a little bit of speed with the same variation we are using always. 45 can be nice, the scaling can be little, so 5. Let's try to use the viscosity, but this time I think we need to use a really huge viscosity because we are using the find target to move the particles. So let's go for 1000 with 45% of variation. Okay, let's go to C. Okay, you see that the particles are moving really slow, so we have to start taking care about it. So we have the first find target, it's not a problem. Let's go to see this one, for example. This one has the speed as set to 300. Let's go for 600 with 70 for the acceleration, so we are speeding up the animation of the filaments, so they are moving faster to go and create. Let's do the same for the there again. Let's try with an higher speed, and maybe we can also change a little bit the value there. So let's say that maybe we start to 100 with 25 for the variation to start creating the find target before, so it should be faster to move. Okay, and something that can be done too is to have the big sphere just a little bit more little. Let's see now the animation. So we have this sphere of particles creating some filaments. Okay, we should need a little bit more frames. Let's try 450. And maybe we can make down the particles step by step. So there we can use a delete. So we have the particles going away during the animation, and let's say maybe the lifespan will be let's try with 400. and 50. So we should have particles until some frames, and then we should start seeing the particles dying. Let's go back. Let's try with a lower age. Okay, you see that the particles are starting to die. Let's go for a lower value. Okay, so we have just a little bit of particles, and we can go for maybe just a little bit less, but we can just maybe set a lower value there. Let's try with 250. It will regenerate the particles. Okay, and let's see. Okay, and again, here let's say that it is a little bit faster. Let's go lower. I like to find the best compromise between the particles there. So, you know, let's go there to have maybe a little bit less viscosity on the first one. I mean the trails we are creating from the trails. And let's go to have maybe 50 frames more. Okay, so everything is done. So we have all the particles needed, so we have to start preparing the final version for the rendering with Krakatoa and tune with the Magmaflow, and then working with the compositing to obtain something visible. So we can save the project, and then that's ready to move to the next step on the part 3.